Thank you so much. And now we have another excellent paper on a different sort of law. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jimmy Wolf, Nugent Doctoral Fellow, who will be giving a talk titled An Ambiguous Race, Armenian and Assyrian Identities in Roman and American.
Michael. So I'll say really quickly, there's a point where I'm going to be clicking like a madman on the PowerPoint, so I might think that'll work this time. Okay. Okay, thank you all. So I would like to kind of invite us to dive back into the world of Tacitus, which we were so well introduced with Cliff, and kind of reinvestigate these questions about race and identity that he investigates in his text as an ethnographer. So a term that has introduced this to as well. So in the this way. Okay, there's a handout going around. I apologize for all the trees. Okay. So in the second book of his Annales, the Roman historian Tacitus records that in the year 16 CE, there was general unrest on the eastern frontier of the empire, with several of Rome's independent client kingdoms in a state of disarray. It began, Tacitus explains, in the Parthian Empire, who hated their king Vonones as if he were a foreigner. Even though he was a member of the Arsacid dynasty, or what Tacitus calls the Arsacid gens. Vonones, however, had spent the last 20 years living in Rome as a prisoner of war in the household of the Emperor Augustus. And Vonones was placed on the throne of the Parthian Empire only after the death of his father, and a contingent of the Parthian nobility had come to Rome to ask the Emperor Augustus to crown him king. Yes, okay. Tacitus states that at first the barbarians, the barbari, were happy with their new king, but soon their joy turned to shame, for they were saying that the Parthians had become inferior to their ancestors. They had sought a king from another part of the globe who was tainted or infectum by the arts of their enemies. Now the throne of the Arsacids was numbered among the Roman provinces and given away. According to Tacitus, then, the Parthians were dismayed by the fact that they had degenerated, literally had become unlike their gens. Not only because they had become an ersatz Roman province, but also because their new king had, for lack of a better term, Romanized. Eventually, Artabanus seized the throne of the Parthian Empire from Vonones, who fled to Armenia because it was, at that time, empty, vacua, a power vacuum between the Parthian and the Roman empires, but one that was unfaithful to Rome, ever since Mark Antony had deceived its king, Artavasdes II, and murdered him in 34 BC. As a result, even though Vonones was propped up by Rome in what Tacitus will later call a toy court, a ludibrium, Rome could expect little support from the Armenians in return. This is because, Tacitus explains, the Armenians have since long ago been an ambigua gens, and we can compare our translations later, an ambiguous race, both according to the spirit of their people, hominum and geniis, and Armenia's geographic location, situate, which shares a long border with the Roman provinces and yet stretches deep into Persia, or the antiquarian term, the Medes. The Armenians who live between these two great empires, Maximisque and Periis, therefore are often of two hearts, discorde sunt, with hatred towards the Romans and envy towards the Parthians. When Tacitus wrote the Annales in 117 CE, he had already honed his skills as an ethnographer in two other texts, known as the Agricola and the Germania, in which he describes in detail the laws, customs, physical appearances, and so-called national characters of two other barbarian groups living outside the borders of the empire, the Britons, the Britanni, and the Germans, the Germanii. Unlike the Armenians, Tacitus praised the Germans not only for being indigenous to the lands they inhabit, but also for not having been mixed at all by marriage with any other races. As a result, the Germans have not been tainted through marriage with any other nations, Tacitus argues. They exist as their own distinct and pure race completely unto itself. In his Agricola, Tacitus directs his imperial gaze onto the Britons. Unlike the pure indigenous Germans who all look the same, the Britons do not. And so, as Tacitus states, one can make certain arguments based on the differences in their physical appearances. Those who have red hair must be Germans. Those who have dark hair must be related to the Spaniards, and those living near Gaul either resemble the Gauls because they share a common ancestry, or perhaps they have adapted physically to a common climate. In this way, therefore, the Britons seem to be somewhat racially ambiguous, just like the Armenians, who are not racially pure, right, and whose customs, the hunt, banquets, and so on, resemble those of the Parthians, those barbarian neighbors to their east. However, the Britons pay tribute to Rome and dutifully obey the injunctions of the empire. And so, unlike the Armenians, they are not ambiguous imperial subjects because they can be trusted, despite their apparent racial ambiguity. The Armenians therefore fall short of their fellow British and German barbarians in two distinct ways. They are neither their own pure race, nor can they be trusted as subjects of empire. For Tacitus, then, his choice to describe the Armenians as an ambigua gens was pointed and purposeful, a direct criticism of their being bad imperial subjects. And we can sense the frustration with which Tacitus describes the Armenians and how their political allegiances, just like their national character, could switch between the two empires of Rome and Persia. It was therefore literally ambiguous, that is, it could go both ways. As Justo Traina has argued, Tacitus therefore effectively weaponizes the racial ambiguity of the Armenians in his Annales in order to provide, retroactively, a good pretext for the invasion of Armenia and the extension of Roman imperial rule over the Armenians. Today, however, I would like to explore further the concepts of race, identity, and imperial subjectivity that we see in the Annales through comparison with a modern example of the apparent racial ambiguity of Armenian and Assyrian Christians in American imperialist discourses at the beginning of the 20th century. To do so, I will focus on the career of E.W. McDowell, an American Presbyterian missionary who served in the West Persia mission for 40 years, from 1887 until 1928, as a teacher and advocate for the Armenian and Assyrian Christian communities living in what is today northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey during the height of the Armenian and Assyrian genocides. Born on March 13, 1857 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, McDowell attended Worcester College in Ohio and then matriculated to the Western Theological Seminary outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After graduating in 1887, he traveled to Baghdad, where he was photographed by the Armenian photographer F.G. Donatosian. He then moved to Mosul and then to Urmia, where the United Presbyterian Mission had its headquarters. After the death of his first wife in 1916, now remarried, McDowell eventually settled in Bakuba in 1921, where this photo was taken. Bakuba was a city about 30 miles to the northeast of Baghdad that would become famous as one of the largest refugee camps for Assyrian Christians fleeing the genocide, or the Saigon. In 1928, McDowell moved back to the States, settling briefly in Columbus, Ohio, home of the Ohio State University, go Bucks, where he befriended the former president of the Ohio State University, William Oxley Thompson, who was a fellow graduate of the Western Theological Seminary. He then moved right here to Ann Arbor in 1932 and lived with friends first on North Ingalls Street and then at 705 Church Street. We are currently at 500 Church Street for reference. So about a 1-minute walk from here. In addition to his duties as a missionary, McDowell was obsessed with one thing and one thing above all else: manuscripts. In 1931, McDowell donated 42 Syriac manuscripts to the Reverend Robert E. Spear, the General Secretary of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, and a graduate of the Princeton Theological Seminary. Spear, in turn, donated all 42 manuscripts to the seminary's Wright Library, and today these manuscripts constitute the seminary's entire collection. They are currently being cataloged for the first time by Kathleen McVeigh, Professor Emerita at the seminary. Last year, I was asked to identify one of these manuscripts that was in a state of disarray. Although in 1966, the Syriac scholar J.T. Clemens saw the manuscript on his tour of North America and described it very briefly as a lexicon, nothing else was known about it. However, thanks to a short colophon on folio 19 verso of what was originally over a 500-page manuscript, I was able to identify the text as a Garshuni edition of Barbachel's Syriac to Arabic lexicon, as well as the name of the scribe Joseph Bar Elia, who was active at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The manuscript is remarkable for several reasons, which I would love to discuss later, but do not have time to do so right now, except that it is the single largest edition of Barbachel's lexicon known to exist. For reference, each folio is almost 2 feet tall. And if you expand that over 500 pages, it is quite a large manuscript. It would not fit on this table. And so perhaps this was why McDowell, who was obsessed with manuscripts, brought it back to him with the States, despite it having no provenance. In the remainder of my talk today, however, I would like to examine McDowell's oral testimony that he provided for the 1924 House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization on behalf of the Assyrians, or whom he calls the Mountain Nestorians. This is the same committee that would pass the 1924 Immigration Reform Act, which severely restricted immigration into the US based on a system of national quotas, and completely barred immigration from Asia. Originally known as the Johnson-Reed Act, the 1924 Immigration Reform Act was passed on May 26, 1924. In Section 12A of the Act, the committee defined nationality, a term that they use in alternation with race, as an individual's country of birth, treating as separate countries the colonies, dependencies, or self-governing dominions for which separate enumeration was made in the United States Census of 1890. The Assyrians, because they lived in Asia, would therefore be counted as, big air quotes, Asiatics, and thus completely barred from entry to the United States. In January of 1924, Representative Charles Brown of New Jersey invited McDowell to testify before the committee. In the hearing, he introduced McDowell as an American missionary who had lived with the Nestorians for over 25 years. He stated that, now, I understand that they are to be taken in as Asiatics when they are not. Representative Arthur Free of California next asks Representative Brown, have you lived among them? Which he had not, to which Free replied, I would just as soon live among a bunch of rats. Next, I'd like to highlight a few exchanges between McDowell and members of the committee during his oral testimony that reveal how imperial categories of race, both in the ancient and modern worlds, are generative of racial ambiguities. The first followed McDowell's description of the Assyrians and their home and where they lived. After indicating on a map, Representative Raker asks, who has control of this country you speak of now, Mesopotamia? It is under the king Faisal, son of the king of Mecca or the king of Hejaz. He is the father of 2 sons and goes on to explain this situation. Is it a kingdom or what? It is a kingdom, but it is under the mandate of the English. Under the mandate of what country? The English have a mandate over Mesopotamia, but it is not the same mandate as in Palestine. The Arabs have their own government. Are not these people governing themselves in the same way? No. These people are a refugee people at the present time, as I shall indicate in a moment. They have been driven out of their homes, and at present they are a refugee people. Where did they come from? They come from the northeast of Mosul. A part of them are living under the Turkish government, and a part of them are living under the Persian government. What do you want to do with them? Bring them to the United States? No, I would if I could, but I'm not expecting that. I mean national justice. And after being asked, what do you mean by national justice? He says, I mean justice in this way, that these people are not Asiatic, as we regard the term. They are of a higher type. That is one thing. They are not Asiatics, but they have been discriminated against in that they have been included among other Asiatics and have not had their fair share when it comes to getting the quota. What vocation do they follow? They are farmers and sheep raisers. Are they a nomadic people? They are a people. the oldest Christian people in the world. In the first few centuries, these people carried the gospel across Asia from Jerusalem, establishing schools and churches. They have been building churches in which I have preached, and some of the churches are over 1,000 years old. How impressive. How much does the religion of these people resemble our Christian religion? As you know, America is a theocratic state. It resembles it absolutely. They are not much nearer God than we Americans are. We are all short, but they hold the same perceptions and doctrines that we do. They pray on Sunday and steal on Monday. Some of them, just as some Americans do. Let me put this to you. Do you not agree that a people coming to this country should be people that could be assimilated, that our children could marry? They could be assimilated. Would you want a child of yours to marry one of them? And the chairman says, strike that out. I will answer that, McDowell says. I can imagine something a great deal worse than any one of my children marrying one of them. I do not get through my head the situation that they are in politically. England has a mandate over them. England has a mandate over them. And who is directly their superiors? The Arab government of Mesopotamia in part, and in part the Persian government across the border. Who oppresses them? The Kurds, the Turks, the Arabs. They are not Turks. No, they are not Turks. They are not Arabs. No, they are not Arabs. They are Assyrians and are different from Syrians in northwestern Persia. Yes, sir. Do they assimilate with the Turks and Arabs? No, they do not. There is very little or no intermarriage between them. Why is that? Because of prejudice. These are Christian people proud of their past. They live in the heart of the inaccessible Kurdish mountains and have retained the traditions of their fathers. They were illiterate, but they have kept on hand, yes, their old manuscripts written by their forefathers. They would allow the Kurds to carry off their sheep, their cattle, and their women, but have preserved their old books until the present war. They are proud of their past and will not assimilate with the Muslim people. Do they hold their home property in Mesopotamia? They have no property of their own. Their property was in their own territory. Do they have any property where they are living now? No, they are living in villages. Who owns the land they live on now? Clearly, they don't get it. The land was owned by the Kurds and Arabs. And then he goes in and discusses briefly what the English have done. Who owns the land now? Still can't get it. Originally, it was owned by Kurds. Somebody must have sovereignty over it. Things are very loose over there, especially at the close of the war. It was under the control of the English, and the English tried to get rid of the people disposed of them by assigning them certain deserted villages. They are living in this large territory, and someone must have sovereignty over the land. That is the ownership of the land. Eventually, McDowell explains that the land they inhabit, and which they have inhabited from time immemorial, cannot be judged according to the laws of sovereignty and property that they are familiar with in the United States. He states there's a great deal of unoccupied territory there, no man's land, so to speak. Clearly, the complex political situation that the Assyrians found themselves in was confusing to the members of the House Committee, who were trying to apply American categories of race, identity, and sovereignty to a very different context. As a result, a few days later, McDowell wrote a written testimony in which he outlined the key points of his argument so that they could better understand. In it, McDowell explains that, again, they are not Asiatics in the common sense of the term. In language, they are Assyrians, speaking a modern form of the language used by our Savior when on earth, which is Aramaic. Moreover, McDowell states that because of their centuries of adherence to the Christian faith, they have been kept separate from the Asiatics about them. Because of this, they have close affinity to the people of the West. As a result, they are in themselves a distinct unit. And so, according to McDowell, it would be a gross injustice to classify them as other Asiatics because through their firm adherence to the Christian faith, throughout the ages, they have kept their blood pure from intermixture with the Asiatic races. It has always been an exceedingly rare thing for one of them to intermarry with one of the Muslim races. In many ways, then, McDowell's description of the Assyrians relies on similar imperial discourses on race, identity, and subjectivity that Tacitus relies on to describe the Armenians, the Britons, and the Germans. For example, just as Tacitus valorizes the Germans' claims to indigeneity and praises them for remaining racially pure by not practicing intermarriage, McDowell also emphasizes the fact that the Assyrians have remained racially pure, untainted by marriage with the Asiatic or Muslim races. Moreover, just as Tacitus states that Armenia was a political power vacuum, or as he says, empty, which was certainly not the case, so too does McDowell characterize the Assyrian homeland as a lawless no man's land. However resolute McDowell was in his testimony that the Assyrian Christians were racially pure and not Asiatics, this was not always the case. In 1912, McDowell wrote a memorandum addressed to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, in which he proposes a solution to the challenge of evangelizing the Kurds and the Arabs. According to McDowell, the Assyrians are perfectly suited for this purpose for two reasons. The first is physically. Their own hard life, active in deep, hot, miasmatic valley on rugged mountaintops, has adapted them to perform the labors and to undergo the hardships incident to evangelistic work among the Kurds and Arabs. The second reason is racial. They are of the same race, practically, as those among whom they are to labor, all children of the East. And as such, they understand them socially, intellectually, and spiritually. Not only does this directly contradict what he states in his later testimony before Congress, but it also begs the question, how did McDowell see the Assyrians? As a distinct, pure race of Christians living amongst lower orders of Asiatics, or as one of many children of the East? The word practically here, I believe, is key, as it reveals that McDowell was very purposefully fudging in order to bolster his argument that the Assyrians should be used by the Presbyterian Church to evangelize the Kurds and the Arabs. McDowell's dichotomous descriptions of the Assyrians in these two distinct fora also reveal that regardless of how he personally conceptualized race, McDowell was able to modulate how he characterized the Assyrians racially, because they did not fit into the pre-established categories as defined by the 1890 US Census. According to the census, they would be simply other Asiatics, not specified. Therefore, even though in both fora McDowell made a very different argument in order to advocate on behalf of the Assyrians, in no way did he challenge the ways in which the US government classified peoples living elsewhere according to its own categories of race, just as Tacitus does in the text we examined above. Instead, McDowell capitalizes on the Assyrians' apparent racial ambiguity in the eyes of the United States government in order to portray them as a pure Christian race, eager to become American citizens and join the rest of the West. McDowell's fudging is perhaps no more apparent in his short exchange that he had with Representative Dickstein during the hearings before the House Committee. McDowell says that when asked if he believed that the Assyrians would make good as American citizens, McDowell says that they would, and more importantly, that they already have. He explains that he and his wife had managed to provide aid to thousands of Assyrian Christians living in the Middle East, thanks to the Assyrians in this country, which are Armenians, who sent nearly $1 million to their people over there. But just a few moments later, Representative Dickstein will ask McDowell to clarify, wait, are they Armenians? And McDowell answers, no, they are not. They are a separate people nationally. They are Assyrians. How ambiguous. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Now I'd like to welcome Eileen Doss for a response. And then we will open it up for questions and discussion. It will go 5 minutes late, but I'll end it absolutely at 10:52. Right. Sorry. So,
okay. Say it's like, well, it's like as a short person, it's so hard to find out, but no, it's fine. It's all right. I'm used to this world not being kind of made by shortness. Okay, so let me get going. First, I want to thank both Jimmy and Cliff for not only sharing their papers with me, but also opening themselves up to receive a live response to their work in such a public setting. So I always want to kind of acknowledge that as generosity and bravery and my books. So the following response represents, in a somewhat more ordered fashion, the cluster of thoughts that came to me while reading your very different papers. And these cluster of thoughts really maybe circulated or arose primarily as pertains to the methodological issues of how to write about race in a pre-modern context. And what gets obscured when imperial powers are grounded in such discussion. So, and this, what I'm going to say in the follow, I do not have answers to, and I'd like to think with you kind of about this issue about how to write about race in a pre-modern context. So, so your paper's really stimulated kind of this thought on this issue. So the conceptualization of race that seemed for me to emerge in both papers as a category that crosses time, that not always, but often marks a phenomenal difference, and what actually phenomenal is differently expressed, shows to me the seemingly inescapable power that modern ideas of race exert even on our understandings and how we at least frame understandings of race in the past. So the narrative operated in Wolff's analysis that Armenian peoples from Tacitus to McDowell have been in ambiguous gens, which Jimmy translates as race, which I think we should kind of talk about methodological choices about translating gens either as race or ethnicity. I find really interesting. I would like to kind of hear from you both about what went into that. And the distinction in Ando's paper between realist and nominalist approaches to race or ethnicity, for me, doesn't really trouble race as an essential reality, a premise at the heart of modern race. The association of race with fixity and natural reality is a product of 19th and 20th century colonial apologetics that utilize biologizing explanations, central to which were and still are the frames of blood, anatomy, and I guess more current genetic or geneticizing explanations such as phenotypes to legitimate the violent exploitation of Black and Indigenous American people in particular. This logic denies race the same flexibility and contingency that is now often accorded to ethnicity as an identity category that even admits self-selection. So I'm just interested about when we choose race versus ethnicity and the sort of flexibility that ethnicity has that race doesn't. Not only in describing present kind of identity categories, but past categories. So this is kind of an issue that I'm struggling with, you know, why ethnicity often seems kind of a more comfortable than race. Although limiting its conclusions to the Roman context, Ando's paper captures for me how racecraft is always a discursive practice, albeit one that purports to root its claims in the phenomenal to very real world effect. His study of Pliny and Roman inscriptional sources reveals that race, or rather in his preferred terms, ethnicity, is ambiguous, not in the sense of being unclear, but rather bidirectional. So I think in your paper you translated two-faced, or I think also in the earlier paper, which I'm having it both ways, and Jimmy, you also do kind of having it both ways. This nice kind of directionality versus just unclear, ambiguous. I find kind of really productive. I take this to mean that how race is interpreted and acquires sociocultural significance depends on positionality. In most cases, the person or group's relation to those whose racecraft is more impactful. So those who have capital, kind of who a marking of difference can matter or matter more significantly. For example, blood itself can be inscribed with new racial or ethnic meaning with a change in legal status, as Ando's paper makes clear, when the state articulates one's belonging differently. So how blood can even change kind of its categorization. So you bring up how non-Roman blood can become consanguineous with Roman blood, and you use the frame of consanguinitas through the endowment of Roman citizenship. So I find that kind of an interesting kind of example about kind of the that really captures the discursive nature of racecraft, not only in the past, but I would say we talk about it in the present too as well. So the conference as a whole, and Jimmy and his papers in particular, focus on imperial impositions of racial categories onto groups of people. Both papers, however, contain suggestive traits and even lacunae that seem to complicate this unilateral production of race by recognizing the subversive navigation of imperial racial hierarchies by minority individuals or groups. So I'm interested about not only how imperial categories can be imposed on it, but how groups on the ground, because these minority groups can navigate and kind of create meaning within these own categories. So it's not just kind of a unilateral kind of or one directional way of producing race. And I'm going to cite now evidence that you didn't bring up in your presentation, but I found was really kind of interesting from your paper. So Sorry, you folks, we'll read kind of the longer paper if you want. So evidence of the instability as evidence of the instability of ethnicity, Annals paper cites an imperial inscription that accuses certain Alpine tribes, the Anauni, Tuliasi, and Sinduni, of passing as members of the Tridentini, who had Roman citizenship. So it's this inscription that accuses certain individuals, certain tribes, passing themselves as members of a tribe who had Roman citizenship. So the participation of these non-Roman tribes in supposedly Roman exclusive institutions, such as the Praetorian Imperial Guard and law courts as jurors, prompts imperial authorities to grant them Roman citizenship to maintain these institutions' integrity. At least that's how I kind of read it. And maybe please kind of, if I've not gotten this right, please correct me. So I have poems a little bit about describing what's going on in this situation as passing, primarily because of the emotionally fraught practices linked to a particular kind of racial oppression, black oppression in the US. To be fair, I don't have a better suggestion of what to call this. What is it? It's kind of like, I was thinking about maybe masking a theory of sociology via dramaturgy is more productive here. And getting rid, perhaps kind of not implicating oneself in this very kind of fraught kind of historically textual practice of passing in the US. And perhaps we can talk about this issue in the broader discussion. Regardless, passing hinges not only on external, but also self-perceptions of racial belonging. So I'm kind of interested about the kind of how minoritized people are seeing themselves presented and how they're presented. We do not get what the Anauni or Tuliasi and Sinduni see themselves as doing, because the inscription in this example is framing what an informant alleges to be seeing of these groups' self-positioning. So I find that interesting. It is left unsaid from where this informant comes from. Are they an internal member of one of these tribes, a member of the tribe that is Roman citizenship, the Tridentini, or even an imperial official? So we don't know kind of who is informing or kind of who is calling these other groups out as kind of passing. Be that as it may, the very indeterminacy of race or ethnicity, whether it's in the antebellum or post-Reconstruction US or the Roman Empire, provided openings for the mobilization of exclusionary categories for expanded opportunities, whether this is economic, legal, and social. So I'm trying to think about kind of more dialogic and dialectical kind of understanding of race that doesn't that captures not only what imperial powers are imposing, but how these categories can do work kind of for minoritized individuals. So Wolf's paper also left me wondering to the extent to which the portrayal of Armenian and Assyrian Christians as ambiguous in between Rome and Parthia and E.W. McDowell's imagination, the West and Asia, may have benefited their interests. Similar to the inscription about the Anauni, Tuliasi, and Sinduni, the testimony of E.W. McDowell, Congress does not permit any of his Assyrian Christian informants in Europe to speak for themselves, however. So we're just getting out of what he kind of perceives. In his deposition, throughout which lurks Islamophobic currents of thought. So that was just kind of sprayed kind of so he's focusing on Christianity, but it's like Islamophobia just is the veneer pretty strong there. So McDowell cites these so-called mountain historians' Christian faith as insulating them from racial admixture from the surrounding Asiatic Muslim populations, as he calls them. And he quotes, through their firm adherence to the Christian faith, throughout the ages, they have kept their blood pure from intermixture with the Asiatic races. It has always been an exceedingly rare thing for one of them to intermarry with any of the Muslim races, as kind of cites. So McDowell biologizes Christianity as a way of attenuating the racial difference that the Johnson-Breed Act of 1924 imposes between the Assyrian and Armenian peoples, to which he probably did evangelize as a Presbyterian minister in Bahuba, Iraq, and the American publics who are white Protestant middle class, kind of, that's how kind of Congress is imagining what the American public is, imagined it was protecting. So reading McDowell's testimony, so I wonder whether reading McDowell's testimony against the grain, we can discern a subversive reframing of a position of exclusion to a rhetoric of exceptionality. So the Assyrian and Armenian groups with which McDowell had some contact in mandatory Iraq were disenfranchised with no apparent political representation among the British colonial forces or King Faisal even Hussein's government. Did they contribute to a narrative that foregrounded one of the bases for their marginalization and mandatory Iraq for Christian faith to create a bond of affinity with a group outsider that could do political work for them? So just thinking about the extent to which kind of McDowell's kind of narrative could have been kind of shaped by his informants on the ground, kind of on it. So not just kind of an imposition of an imperial power, but what are these informants saying kind of about their own kind of positionality to somebody who could do and advocate for them. So I do not need to minimize the oppression these peoples faced from within mandatory Iraq, from McDowell and other foreign colonial powers. So I'm just my focus on the subversive kind of navigation does not mean to kind of flatten that they very much were kind of oppressed and facing violence. However, I want to underscore the dialectical nature of racecraft that involves multiple actors with varying access to power in all its forms: political, economic, exclusionary, economic, intellectual, etc. So my question then, and then I just pose this to both you, but everybody in this room, my question then is, how do we write a history of imperial racecraft that stays attuned to complex entanglements of agency, where identity formation is not an exclusionary elite privilege? So I'll leave it at that. All right, thank you both.
Respond.
Yeah, I was going to say, I tried not, I think with the exception of quoting the perspectives that come, I tried not to use the term race, and I certainly did not use the term minority.
Yeah, and I would be interested in why that choice not to use race.
I mean, with the exception of, some level it's a decision to avoid an anachronism. I actually do think you can speak of racialized discourses in Greek citizenship laws and discussion that arises out of. I don't think actually. I don't think that the way the Romans approach it. I don't think what the Romans talking about is anything like what we talk about.
Yeah, but as a point, I guess it's like I'm using kind of our conception of race as a frame to understand kind of ancient racecraft. I guess that's the problem I have, like for what you're doing about this novelist approach, to me, that is racecraft, that is this discursive like about not just seeing a person's skin color kind of or kind of different clothing and saying that this is race, but like marking identity kind of as kind of whether it's juridical or coming from a juridical perspective, kind of to me that novelist approach to me just captured what racecraft is, just full stop. So what we saw as a Roman phenomenon to me sees it as kind of a broader transhistorical.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. I mean, I guess so. I mean, at some point in my life, for various reasons.